All right, hi. So today I'm going to be covering the Florida FFA Citrus CDE. This is a pretty unique CDE given that it is unique exclusively to Florida. So similar to aquaculture, how it is not a national competitive CDE. Aquaculture, I believe, is competing in a couple of other states, but citrus is exclusive to Florida to my knowledge. Today we are going to go over a bit of a description of the career development event, what it's about, how do you study for it, why it's important. Then we'll go over the individual practicums. So it does cover four different sections of species identification, as well as a written exam. And then resources. How do we study for this? The super daunting part. How do you train a team for the citrus career development event? Okay. So according to the Florida FFA, the citrus CDE stimulates learning activities to the production and management of citrus fruits. That's so fabulous. It's the great thing about the citrus CDE is that it is so unique to Florida. And especially as you're training these teams through middle school and then especially high school, they're getting a lot of skills and a lot of knowledge about their local community, about their local economy, and as well as skills to join that local community or join that local workforce. So giving them those skills and knowledge to maybe just appreciate, if not participate in the Florida citrus industry. So the Citrus CDE, this is a team event. You can have up to 4 team members. It can be as low as 3, and that's because the 3 top individual scores make the team score. So how this works when you're competing on a team of 4 or even a team of 3, but each student is competing individually. And then out of the 4 team members, 3 of the top 3 scores will be taken, and that's what makes the team score. So students are not answering questions together. Every student is answering all of the questions we're about to cover absolutely individually. They get an individual score, and then whoever is the top 3 scores on that team is what makes that team score. The 4th one is a drop score, which is why you're able to compete with just 3 members on a team, because then just all 3 of those scores would count towards your top score. Okay. For this event, similar to a lot of identification and written exam events, so things like forestry, aquaculture, horse evaluation, meat evaluations, this has a virtual preliminary. So typically a couple months in advance or a month in advance, there is a virtual preliminary held by the Florida FFA where students take the exam online. If they are within the top 20 teams of that virtual prelim, they get to go on to the state competition in person. For this one, it's typically held in Haines City at the Leadership Training Center. And it's a really great opportunity for students to get to go do an in-person CDE. It doesn't take a very long time. This year it was just a morning. We were back before the end of the day. I got a half-day sub. So a super fun, interactive, but honestly a very approachable career development event. And that's why I like it so much. So what's so good about it? And I'm already kind of talking about it, but it is Florida's #1 ag commodity. So being able to interact with something that is so important to the local state that you're in is just really fabulous. And especially in our area, the area that I teach in, it is a semi-rural area. So you do pass orange groves on your way home or your way to the store. So feeling a little bit more connected to that is really nice, as well as just something that people do see in the store all the time, something that they're a little bit more familiar with. So it's very local. This is also a great CDE for chunking. So as a teacher, we've talked about chunking sometimes, and a lot of times with these very daunting identification career development events, I have a tough time breaking it down for my students. So if I were to talk about something like aquaculture is a fabulous career development event, but there's over 80 different fish to learn, and that can be really tough to break it down for students. And then as a student, it's really tough to practice and memorize and understand where to start. And you can obviously chunk it on your own, but once you add more and more, it gets really difficult. What I think is very nice about the Citrus CDE and what makes it so approachable, and I think a really great starter CDE, is there's no more than 37 to 40 individual specimens in each identification area or each identification topic. So there's no more than, I think, 31 weeds. There's no more than 37 pests and pathogens. So it kind of chunks it for you. It limits those lists and makes them a little bit less daunting and makes it a lot easier to approach that each week. Okay, this week we're going to be talking about weeds. This week we're going to talk about this. And it helps the students move through the content in a way that works better for their brains. Lastly, it's really nice how inclusive this is able to be. So because we're not relying on different animals and things like that, they are able to take the top 20 competitors from the prelims to the finals. A couple of the career development events we have are a lot more exclusive, especially once we get towards LDEs. very few students make it past the school level. Only one person can compete per school for things like prepared public or extemporaneous. Whereas for citrus, every student in your school could potentially compete. There is no limit to that prelim. If you go over 8 students, typically there is a fee, but it's very small. And so a lot of students get to compete in this event. Like I said, it's very approachable. It's very accessible for a lot of students. Also, a lot of students get to go get that in-person experience at the state event because they accept so many teams. And this is just on the middle school level. I speak from the middle school experience, but they take the top 20 middle school teams and then the top 20 high school teams. So that's almost 200 students that get that opportunity to do an in-person career development event, which can usually be a pretty exclusive experience. So especially this year, I had a team that was a brand new team and they still got to go to that in-person event. And so that shows just how approachable it can be. Not easy by any means. There's still a winner, and it's still very rigorous, and it can come down to just a few specimens. But having so many students be able to compete is a really awesome opportunity, and I think it's great that the Florida FFA has that. So like I said, there are 2 parts to this career development event. It is all test-based. It's all multiple choice. Well, not all multiple choice. Let me correct that. So let me not get ahead of myself. There are 2 parts. There's the individual practicums, or the identification practicums. So that is 4 different categories of identification that the students have to be familiar with. So we're going to cover that on the next slide. And then the multiple choice portion is the knowledge practicum, or the general knowledge exam. So members are tested on general principles of the citrus industry. There is one primary reference, so this is where they're going to be pulling all of their information from, and that is the Citrus Growing in Florida, 5th edition by Jackson and Davies. In the odd years, so keep in mind the years are based on the date of the state event, but in Florida, typically both the prelim and the state event are earlier in the year, so before the year turns over. So for us this year, it was 2023. So on odd years, they're going to be testing out of the odd chapters of that book. And then on even years, they'll be testing out of the even chapters of that book. And that's how you can break down that information a little bit further. For those identification practicums, there are 4 different ones. First, we have rootstock, leaves, and fruits. Then pests, pathogens, parasites, and predators, diseases and disorders, and weeds. So on the right side, you can see that it shows all of the possible specimens. So what that means is in the very back of that rule manual where you get to see all about your CDE from the Florida FFA CDE website, there's a breakdown of all of the different specimens that you'll need to know. And this is where I pulled that information from, and some information we're going to see a little bit later on. So out of that list, there are 37 rootstock, leaves, and fruits that students should familiarize themselves with. That being said, they're only going to be tested on 25, and it's not like it's the first 25 or the last 25. It is 25 randomly. So it's important that they're familiar with all 37, not just the first 25 on that list. Especially what throws students off is that there's no way to do process of elimination. So compared to if they were familiar with 37 and they're tested on 37, if they come down to the last one, they're not quite sure, it's the last one that's on their list. That's just not what's going to be happening. What it will be is that they will see a specimen in front of them, or if it's the preliminary, there'll be a picture on their screen. And they're given a drop-down list or the list of all 37 possible specimens, and they will choose which one they think it is. So it's almost like a fill in the blank. Next, we have pests, pathogens, parasites, and predators. There are 35 possible specimens out of that category, but they will be tested on 25. Diseases and disorders, there are 34 possible specimens, but they will be tested on 25 as well. And then for weeds, there are 31 possible specimens, but they will only be tested on 15. So like I said, this is only half of the test or part of the test. There's also the written exam, which will be multiple choice and is a little bit more fact-based compared to visual memorization. But this is a huge part of the exam. Having a little bit of technical difficulties. So I just wanted to show you some examples of what that might look like. So these are exact screenshots from that list in the back of the manual. And here's the specimens in order. So some things to look out for when you're identifying rootstocks, leaves, and fruits. That's exactly what it means. You need to be familiar with the leaves, the fruits, and then some of them are categorized as rootstocks because citrus is very good at propagating. So a lot of these are left usually as rootstocks, but you're identifying them usually based on their leaves and their fruits. Students will see the cross sections, so you can see the cross sections of each one of these. On the very far left, we have the Carrizo citronge, and we can see our leaves. We can see the cross section, the seeds. Some ways to identify this could be based on its very perfect shape. It's very orange, it's smaller. It has some seeds, but not an overwhelming amount, and the seeds are a normal size. That sounds strange, but as we get further on, you'll see that there's some very large seeds in here. Moving on to the Cleopatra mandarin, it can be very identifiable by the way that the flesh is pulling away from the peel on the outside. We can also see that there's very few seeds. It's a very bright orange flesh as well as a bright orange outside, an identifiable navel that's pointing out, and also a little bit smaller. As we move on to the Pancreas trifoliata orange, I'm not the best at pronunciation. This is where we see that things get a little weird. We have a very thin peel, not a lot of flesh, and a lot of seeds. Also, this is where students cannot go in just without practicing. So from the outside, this would not look like an orange. A lot of students would probably call this a lemon or a lime based on its color. So not all oranges are orange. As we can see to the right, not all lemons are going to be yellow. So being familiar with that, this is an orange, but it's yellow. It's very round. It's about the size of a ping pong ball. And those are some ways that they could identify that. And then lastly, we have the rough lemon. We have a very thick pith, a very thick rind, very little flesh, a very bumpy outside, a couple of different colors that they could be. And so my purpose of showing you this is that there are so many different ways to be able to identify these citrus fruits. So whether it's based on their rind, their seeds, their flesh, their color, their navel, any of those things are going to help you make those small distinguishments, because from the outside, things like the Carrizo citronge and the Cleopatra mandarin might look much more similar compared to when you're looking a little bit closer and looking for things like seeds or flesh. Okay, then here's our pest pathogens and predators. When you're studying for this, it is important to note where on the plant that pest pathogen or predator would be. So we have gonna butcher it, the Ashersonia. And here we can see it's mostly growing on leaves. We have a couple specimens in Petri dishes just for reference, but I also included a bunch of different photos, or chose one with a bunch of different photos to show different stages of development. Because at the state level, they're typically live specimens, it's no guarantee that it will look exactly like image A or image B. It could look like image K, and your student has studied to find a white fungus with red or orange in the middle. Whereas in K, we're seeing that must be an older fungus, or maybe it's dying off. Or even in, it looks like L, that's a lot more spotted than in F, and it's a lot more yellow. So having different images is super duper helpful. A pitfall I've fallen into a bunch of times is using the same photos over and over again to help my students study. And I notice that they become a lot more familiar with the backgrounds of the photos compared to the specimen and the image itself. So being able to change up those backgrounds, or the degree of growth that specimen's in, or the lighting or the placement, can be super duper helpful to make their brains look more closely to, okay, well, this is a white fuzzy fungus that is pretty unique for them. It's growing primarily on the leaf. It can grow in clusters, and things like that. And same thing with the black scale that we see in these second two photos. Being able to note that this insect grows both on leaves as well as fruit, as well as stems. So if you're looking for those fresh specimens, don't rely on it being on a leaf or being on a fruit or on a stem. It could be any of them. It could be all three. It could be scraped off onto a Petri dish. So not relying on the background, but absolutely that's helpful, especially for certain pests and predators that are unique to where they are on that plant. But if it's one that's not unique to that, then you don't want to train them just to recognize the black scale on an orange. Because then if they were to see it on a leaf, they'd say, well, it's definitely not that because I've only ever seen it on an orange. The blue-green citrus root weevil, it's a nice one right there. And then the brown citrus aphid. Here we can see some immature ones as well as mature ones. Typically the specimens are mature, but you never know. It's always good to train all of them. Here we have diseases and disorders. I broke this into 2 slides because we do have nutritional disorders as well as then just diseases. So here we have burette toxicity, copper deficiency. Mostly we're going to see these deficiencies present on the leaves and the degree of where the yellow is coming from. So whether it's coming from the outside in, whether it's on the veining, or from the inside out. And that's usually how you'll be distinguishing it. But here we can see copper deficiency is pretty unique, being present on the bark. And then we have diuron and glyphosate contact injury. This is a pesticide contact injury. What I was taught is that, and this is not super duper appropriate, but I was taught that it always just looks like someone peed on it. So that's how you can always tell that it's a contact injury, at least break it down that way instead of getting caught up in all of the different nitrogen deficiencies, magnesium deficiencies, and all of that. And then here's diseases and disorders. They can be on the fruits, on the leaves, on the trunks. And then here we can see the brown rot. So the third one from the left, being able to see that on different plants. But this is also a really good example of one that I could see my students getting caught on, is being familiar with the pink or the purple background. So being able to change up the photos that you're showing them can be just that important. But this is where it can be very important where that is present, because here we can see Alternia brown spot as well as Alternia leaf spot. It's a very similar, if not identical, fungus. It just grows on different parts of the plant, meaning it is identified differently because of that one. Whereas for the insects, they're not identified based on the part of the plant, or at least their name is not. Lastly, here we have weeds. I'm getting a little stuck. There we go. So lastly, we have weeds. Like I said, these are live specimens, went a little too far. For weeds, it's super duper important for students to be familiar with the leaf blade. So as we can see with the Bahia and Bermuda grass, their seed pods are quite similar. They're not identical, so you can identify them that way. You can also identify them because their leaves are a little bit similar, but they are different on the ends, as well as I believe one has hair and one does not, as well as their stolons are a little bit different. And their size is a little bit different. So Bermuda is going to be a little bit further down to the ground, whereas Bahia is going to get a little bit taller. With the balsam apple vine, we can see the importance of being able to identify different parts of the plant. So like I said, these are live specimens. There's no guarantee that the student will have that bright orange flesh as well as the red seeds of that plant to identify it. So you want them to be familiar with that big leaf, that little 5-point leaf as well. In the event that that fruit is not there, you don't want that to throw them off, because that is very eye-catching. It's a very notable part of that plant, but in the event that that's not there, you don't want that to throw them off. And then same thing with the black nightshade, having the flower, the fruit, and the leaf all be familiar to that student. I wanted to include an example of what a specimen could look like in person. So here you can see an example of a specimen that was at the state competition this past year. They do allow you to go around and take photos afterwards, so this is not contraband. I would take a wild guess and say that this is Johnson grass, but my students are much better at this than I am. But here you can see how there is a number there, and they would have to look at it, decide what it is, and say, okay, question 90 or number 90 is Johnson grass or Bahia grass, whatever they might think it is. And this is a great way to see how those live specimens can look a little bit different from what you might think. So let's talk about resources. How are your students going to study? First and foremost, the very first thing that I always recommend to do when looking at a CDE, alone as the advisor, look at the FFA manual. Make sure this is something you're ready to get into, but then also with your students when you're having an interest meeting or you're showing a student in class, looking at that FFA rules manual. So on the Florida FFA CDE website, you have all of the CDEs there, and every single one has a little rules button. Clicking there opens up a PDF. It has everything you need and more, including going down to the identification specimen list. This is your holy grail for specimens. So while it does not include anything like photos or descriptions, having a concrete list and a definite end is so helpful. So this is listed in the back of the rules manual. It should be the first place you go. And it's what I use to have my students make PowerPoints based on those specimen lists. And they're able to kind of self-manage because I show them where that is. What is linked on the resource button? So on that same Florida FFA CDE page, there is a resource button. This typically takes you to a Dropbox, and that's where I found these last 4 things. Keep in mind, this is all for identification. If we're talking about the written exam, there is that book that we mentioned previously, and that can typically be bought on Amazon, or maybe you could get a class set sponsored to you, or even just a group set. So a couple of books that way students can go through, highlight things, or take notes on them. But as for identification and what we can find on that resource button, we have the Florida Citrus Varieties PDF. So this is by Tucker, Futch, Gamitter, and Kessinger. And this is to help you identify those rootstocks, leaves, and fruits. We have identification of mites, insects, diseases, nutritional symptoms, and disorders on citrus, and that's by Futch. A lot of these are done by UF researchers, which is really fabulous. And you can also find a lot of identification photos online by UF, which is nice. We have identification of weeds in Florida citrus by Futch and Hall. And lastly, I do have a little resource for written exams. Once your students are a little bit more familiar, or if you want to use this as a way to kind of gain interest, there are years and years of previous written exams found in that Dropbox. So the earliest I went back and saw was 2015, but I don't even think I scrolled to the bottom. So there's definitely over 10 years of previous written exams from the state level that you can use, as well as answer keys. So using that as a way to test your students, kind of gauge where they're at. Definitely pick one from the same year that you're testing in. That way you know it's from the same chapters. But also to test them once they've studied a little bit more is really nice. So let's play a game. Now that we're familiar with citrus, we've gotten all of the nooks and crannies about what it's about. Can you identify 5 different types of citrus? So the best way to play this game is you want to trip them up a little. You want to have some citrus that look pretty similar. So I would go to the store, I would find some citrus, make sure that they're identifiable varieties, or you can even go to the farmer's market, places where people are a lot more likely to know the exact species of that citrus. So for round 1, during this round, you will get to see, sniff, and taste the 5 different fruits in front of you. This is your time to study. This is your practicing for the CDE. So try to memorize the unique things about these fruits. You're looking at the peel. You are able to see the cross section. Like I said, you can sniff it. I encourage you to taste it. We want to create those sense memories. And during this time, you'll also be told the names of the fruits. So this is just your studying time. You're not being tested yet. You are trying to memorize these labeled fruits. Okay. During round 2, this is where the testing starts. So during this round, you're going to be presented with 3 of the fruits in a random order, and you're going to try to identify them based on sight. So similar to the CDE, how you are not tested on all of them, there's no option for process of elimination. You are not tested on all of them during this game. So you're going to try to identify them based on sight. You'll be able to see the inside and outside of the fruit. You cannot sniff, touch, or taste it. Exactly like the in-person finals round. Okay, so you're trying to identify just 3 of them. Like I said, this game is played a lot more fun if you have ones that look much more similar, because then you get people really up there and looking at things, and you're looking at the pores or how big they are, and you're seeing people's memory, what they got. And lastly, for round 3, so this one is not true to the competition, but it is just a little bit fun. During this round, you'll be blindfolded and brought 3 of the fruits in a random order to taste test and identify. So see if those taste buds can remember. So like I said, this is not a part of the citrus CDE, but people have sense memories, and we can really take that to our advantage. So it is definitely a privilege to be able to have live specimens, but as many as you can. And if you're looking to expand your land lab, look at including specimens that you can include in your CDE trainings and your CDE practices. So having different types of citrus or even different types of weeds while you want to keep those seeds under control, it can even be helpful to have students grow small batches of weeds to be able to identify, which is really fabulous. But as for the fruits go, eating them to create those sense memories can be really helpful. So if a student has a rough lemon and they're like, oh, that was disgusting, they're probably going to remember that forever because they'll see it and they'll revolt at it and they'll remember the name of it. So creating those deeper memories compared to flipping through pictures or a book or a PowerPoint slide, being able to sit there and taste them and interact with that specimen is much more helpful. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. I would really encourage anyone to consider doing citrus. And I do just love it because it's so approachable. And especially as a middle school teacher, having something that students can really self-manage themselves because of the chunking, because of the way that's broken down. And especially because those live specimens can be so much more accessible than something like aquaculture or forestry. Never going to put another CDE down. I do both of those as well, but this one's a lot more accessible. So this is our team at the State Citrus CDE this past year, and I really do enjoy this. So I hope you consider it.